Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us in another journey into the distant past. Tell me, where are you settling in tonight? And what hour is it by your clock? Leave a comment below. I read everyone, and your thoughts mean the world. While you relax, feel free to like this story and subscribe if you enjoy tales to ease you into sleep. Now, take a deep breath and let the gentle currents of history carry you to Imperial China. In this episode, we explore how a simple plant opium unwound the fabric of the Qing Dynasty, once the mightiest empire on earth. Feel the hush of lacquered halls, a whisper of merchant ships on the Pearl River, and let the weight of centuries slip away. Most people think of the fall of the greatest Chinese empire, the Qing, as being caused by foreign barbarians storming the gates of Beijing in 1900. What actually happened is much more tragic. It all started back in the mid-8th century, when European merchants arrived in Canton. And if you don't know, Canton is Guangzhou. Now they had heard tales from their Indian counterparts about a magical white powder that made you feel pretty damn good. I'm talking about opium, y'all. And this stuff was grown in abundance in Bengal, where it was already a widespread problem. So these merchants started smuggling it into Canton, which at the time was the only legal port for foreign trade in China. And even though it was technically illegal, the Qianlong emperor didn't give a shit because he was too busy stuffing his fat face. And so this opium flowed freely through the city, and soon hundreds of thousands of Manchu princes, Han Chinese bureaucrats, coolies and prostitutes were enslaved to it. This period marked the beginning of the end for the Qing Dynasty, and we have the numbers to prove it. So stay tuned, and let's find out how opium destroyed China's greatest empire, how it started. In the mid-1700s, the Qing government attempted to ban opium imports from India, and even went so far as to execute a few smugglers. But this had little effect since there were no real restrictions on foreign trade in Canton. There were like 600 European merchants living there at the time, and all of them wanted to make money. So they bribed the local officials, who turned a blind eye to the continued flow of opium into the city. It was also super easy to smuggle incense. Most merchants simply put the drug in between layers of cargo and then unloaded it in secret warehouses all across the riverfront. And this part of Guangzhou became known as the Den of Thieves. The riverfront was lined with pleasure boats plying up and down the Pearl River, bringing in opium from Hong Kong and Macau. These boats were usually owned by Indians and Chinese traders who sold the stuff to local gangs, who then distributed it throughout the city. In no time at all, the entire city of Canton, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, was knee-deep in opium smoke. It's hard to tell exactly how widespread addiction was, but some historians estimate that 10% of the population were using it. That's around 300,000 people. And because of the low price, which we'll talk about later, this included everyone from high officials to lowly beggars. And this leads us straight into point 2, how bad it got. Within a few decades, the situation in Canton spread like wildfire throughout the entire empire. By the early 1800s, estimates suggest that 12 million Chinese were addicted to opium. Most of them were poor farmers who grew opium poppies on the side to supplement their income. The drug was cheap, easy to grow, and highly addictive, meaning that there was always demand for it. In fact, it was said that you could pay for an entire year's supply with just 1 month's wages. And this led to whole regions specializing in opium production, which created massive social problems. As we can see in this painting, families split apart as sons and daughters pawned themselves to pay for their next fix. Husbands sold their wives and children, and parents sold their own flesh and blood. Young girls were sent to work in gambling houses or become concubines. Farmers abandoned their fields and herded animals to town to sell in order to buy opium. And before long, millions of people across the empire were hopelessly enslaved to the stuff. At first, the Qing government didn't seem too worried about it because the majority of addicts were poor peasants. But then they realized that addiction wasn't restricted to the lower classes. In fact, many Qing officials were getting hooked too, which meant that they were losing control of the empire. Corruption ran rampant as officials took bribes to look the other way. And when they did get caught, they simply used their connections to transfer to another city and start again. Soon the entire moral fabric of Chinese society was torn apart by opium. By the late 1830s, it was clear to everyone that something had to be done about this opium crisis. So the government appointed an imperial commissioner named Lin Zexu to go to Canton and put an end to it. Now Lin was no fool. He knew that the British were smuggling loads of opium into the city, and so he decided to seize it and destroy it. And in May of 1839, he ordered the confiscation of every opium den in Canton. He personally oversaw the destruction of 20,000 chests of opium, enough to make 20 million bricks. And after that he closed the port and prepared for resistance against any foreigners who tried to come in. The British were not happy about this. They were making too much money selling opium to lose their biggest market. And so they assembled a fleet of warships to go to Guangzhou and teach Lin Zexu a lesson. And that's how the First Opium War began. In November 1839, the British landed troops near Canton and marched toward Guangzhou. But when they got there, they found out that Lin Zexu had evacuated the city and moved his operation to Hong Kong. The British bombarded the city for 2 days, but this didn't do much damage. So they took a whole bunch of Chinese junks and anchored in the river to use as bases. Then they launched attacks on coastal fortifications and cut off the city's water supply. Lin Zexu wasn't having it, though. He managed to sneak out of the city and rally the Chinese forces to intercept the British supply ships. His plan was to starve them out. But the Chinese army was no match for the British Royal Navy. Whenever they attacked the ships, they were blown to smithereens. And soon the Chinese lost interest in fighting. On August 29, 1842, the Chinese signed the Treaty of Nanking, which ceded Hong Kong Island to the British forever, imposed unequal tariffs on Chinese exports, opened 5 more treaty ports for foreign trade, and forced China to pay 21 million silver dollars for the confiscated opium. With the war over, Lin Zexu returned to Beijing and fell out of favor with the emperor. He spent his last years running a casino and opium den. Ironically, the man who fought to save China from opium became an opium addict himself. The First Opium War left the Qing government weakened and discredited. Its pride was shattered, its silver reserves drained, and its territory broken. Over the next half-century, China would be forced to endure 3 more opium wars, a Boxer Rebellion, a Sino-Japanese War, and eventually World War II. And all of this was caused by the addiction crisis that swept the country in the early 1800s. Softly now, let us drift deeper into the age of unequal treaties and internal upheaval. Next, we will trace how opium's shadow fueled rebellions and the rise of regional warlords, further unraveling the once mighty Qing realm. If you are still with us, I am grateful for your presence. Let the flickering lanterns of Qing China guide you deeper into the 19th century. Breathe gently and imagine the scent of sandalwood and ink. This is a story carved in silence and sorrow. In the fading light of a dying empire, scrolls smolder on the wind. Wisps of smoke carry the ashes of 1,000 years, drifting over silent examination halls and abandoned temples. The air is thick with the sickly sweet scent of opium, a poison seeping into the very foundations of a once mighty dynasty. A young boy stands at the edge of his village, wide-eyed and trembling. He watches as a sea of rebels flows past, their banners emblazoned with strange symbols and foreign words. The ground trembles beneath their feet, a harbinger of the upheaval to come. In their wake, they leave whispers of a new Messiah, a man who claims kinship with the Christian God. Hang Shuquan's voice echoes across the land, a siren call to the dispossessed and the desperate. His words ignite a fire in the hearts of millions, a conflagration that will consume cities and devour lives. The Taiping Rebellion rises like a tidal wave, fueled by opium's devastation and the bitter dregs of resentment toward a government grown fat and complacent. In ornate chambers, high officials slumber fitfully, opium pipes still warm in their slack hands. Dreams of power and glory fade into nightmares of collapse and ruin. Outside, the machinery of state grinds to a halt. Edicts gather dust, unread and unenforced. The once proud civil service, backbone of an ancient civilization, crumbles like sand castles before the relentless tide of addiction and apathy. Confucian scholars weep silently in empty halls, their carefully cultivated wisdom rendered impotent in the face of a nation's despair. The rhythmic chanting of examinations falls silent, replaced by the rasping breath of edicts and the distant rumble of cannon fire. Opium's tendrils reach into every corner of society, a creeping rot that eats away at the very soul of China. As the rebellion rages, foreign powers circle like vultures, their appetites whetted by the scent of weakness. British and French warships loom on the horizon, their guns trained on coastal cities. They come bearing grievances, real and imagined, their true motives hidden behind a veneer of diplomatic outrage. The thunder of their cannons shatters the uneasy peace of Beijing. Imperial troops scatter like leaves before an autumn wind. Their training and discipline, no match for modern weaponry and ruthless determination. The forbidden city, inviolate for centuries, trembles as foreign boots march through its sacred precincts. In the Summer Palace, a jewel of Chinese artistry and ingenuity, flames lick at priceless treasures. Soldiers drunk on victory and greed stumble through gilded halls, their arms laden with plunder. The acrid smoke of burning scrolls and tapestries rises into the night sky, a funeral pyre for a dying age. As the flames subside, leaving only ashes and bitter memories, the spirit of a once great empire lies broken. The Qing Dynasty, heir to millennia of tradition and power, finds itself adrift in a world it no longer understands. The old certainties have crumbled, swept away by the tide of history and the inexorable march of progress. In quiet villages and bustling cities alike, ordinary people struggle to make sense of the chaos engulfing their world. Farmers tend their fields with wary eyes on the horizon, never knowing when marauding armies might descend upon them. Merchants conduct their business with trembling hands, aware that fortunes can be made and lost in the blink of an eye. The boy who watched the rebels pass grows into a man, his eyes hardened by years of conflict and uncertainty. He stands on the walls of his village, scanning the distance for threats both foreign and domestic. In his heart, he carries the weight of a civilization in decline, the knowledge that the world he inherited is slipping away like sand through an hourglass. In the opium dens of Shanghai and Canton, lost souls chase oblivion in clouds of sweet smoke. Their dreams are haunted by visions of a glorious past, now fading like mist before the harsh light of day. Each inhalation is a step further from reality, a desperate attempt to escape the crushing weight of a world in flux. The Taiping Rebellion rages on, a conflagration that will claim tens of millions of lives before it burns itself out. Villages are reduced to ash, cities to rubble. The land itself seems to groan under the weight of so much suffering, rivers running red with the blood of the fallen. Hang Shuquan's vision of a heavenly kingdom on earth proves as ephemeral as the smoke from his followers' guns. His rebellion, born in the fertile soil of discontent and nurtured by the weakness of a failing state, ultimately collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. But the damage has been done, the old order irrevocably shattered. As the guns fall silent and the smoke clears, China finds itself adrift in uncharted waters. The Qing Dynasty clings to power by its fingernails, its authority eroded beyond repair. Foreign powers circle like sharks, sensing blood in the water. The once mighty empire has become a prize to be carved up and divided among the hungry nations of the West. In the halls of power, what remains of the imperial bureaucracy struggles to adapt to a rapidly changing world. But years of opium addiction and neglect have left deep scars. The machinery of state, once a marvel of efficiency and sophistication, now creaks and groans like an old man rising from his sickbed. Examination halls, once filled with the eager voices of young scholars vying for positions of prestige and influence, now stand empty and forlorn. The Confucian system that sustained Chinese civilization for millennia seems suddenly antiquated, ill-equipped to face the challenges of a new age. As night falls on the empire, lanterns flicker in windows across the land. In humble homes and grand palaces alike, people gather to share stories of better days and whisper fears of an uncertain future. The air is heavy with the scent of incense and the bitter tongue of regret. A new day dawns on a changed China. The sun rises over a landscape scarred by war and ravaged by addiction. But in the hearts of its people, a spark of resilience still burns. They have weathered the storm of rebellion and foreign invasion, emerging battered but unbroken. As the empire weakens from within, new forces begin to stir. In the crucible of conflict and despair, the seeds of renewal are sown. The old order may be dying, but from its ashes, a new China will rise, forged in fire, tempered by adversity, and ready to face the challenges of a world transformed. Now close your eyes and drift forward as the opium cloud grows thicker. We'll next enter the twilight of Qing rule, when even the Empress Dowager ruled beneath the shadow of foreign powers. Manchu cigarette smoke drifts through the twilight air. Two figures stride purposefully across the forbidden city, their breath forming frosty clouds in the crisp evening air. Their footsteps echo off the silent courtyards, the only sound penetrating the stillness of the vast complex. The Manchu emperor sits alone in his winter palace, a prisoner in his own home, while his counselors gather in secret, plotting a way out of the country. It's 1900, and the foreigners are coming. Empress Dowager Cixi holds 2 packs of cigarettes between her wrinkled hands, their pungent aroma mingling with the scent of aged silk and sandalwood incense that permeates her chambers. The first pack is for her personal use, a habit she picked up during her travels in Europe. The second, a gift for the visiting Russian envoy. She lights one, inhales deeply, and blows out a stream of smoke as she addresses the assembled officials. "We must act now," she says, her voice raspy from years of chain smoking, "before it's too late." The year before, 1899, had been a turbulent one for the crumbling Qing Dynasty. The Empress Dowager, who had ruled the Middle Kingdom since the abdication of her drug-addled nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, in 1862, was well aware that the nation was at a crossroads. The once proud and expansive empire was being carved up by rapacious foreign powers, each taking their turn to plunder the riches of the Middle Kingdom. Her advisors tell her that if she wants to stop this humiliation, she has only one option left: embark on a massive industrial and military modernization program in order to bring China back from the brink. But as she puffs thoughtfully on her cigarette, she knows that this would be easier said than done. Since the mid-19th century, when Western gunboats had first forced China to open its ports to foreign trade, the balance of power in East Asia had been steadily shifting away from the Chinese. Following the disastrous Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95, which resulted in the loss of Korea to Japan, many young Chinese intellectuals began advocating for reform along Western lines. The most radical of these called for nothing less than the overthrow of the Manchu government and the imposition of a constitutional monarchy. But even many of those who remained loyal to the Qing court believed that change was necessary. By the end of the 19th century, a group of conservative reformers, led by Kang Youwei and Lao Shishe, had presented a list of 18 proposals to the Dowager Empress that, if enacted, would have modernized the military, reformed the civil service examinations, and introduced a parliament. While most of the reforms were relatively innocuous, Cixi saw them as dangerous and subversive, and the plotters as potential threats to her authority. In 1898, she had Kang and Liang banished from the empire. The attempt to modernize fizzled, and both men went into exile in Japan. But although Cixi ruthlessly snuffed out this particular rebellion, she couldn't help but worry about the future of her dynasty. Surely, she thought, there was some middle ground between the extremes of unbridled westernization and the status quo. The question was where? As she puffed on her cigarettes, she grappled with this question. But the answer, when it came, would be far more drastic than she could ever have imagined. Cixi had never been a heavy opium smoker. Unlike her late husband, the Xianfeng Emperor, whose opium habits allegedly made him unfit to rule, she kept her opium use in check, limiting herself to just 2 or 3 small partaken daily. But Cixi's attitude toward the deadly drug was ambivalent at best. On the one hand, she understood its addictive nature and the damage it could do to individuals and society. On the other, she recognized its potential as a revenue source. During the early years of her reign, Cixi had actually attempted to ban opium smoking in the imperial court. However, after the Second Opium War in 1862, when British and French forces had occupied Shanghai, forcing her to flee west to Chongqing, she had changed her tune. By the time she returned to Beijing 3 years later, Cixi had realized the financial windfalls that could come from controlling the opium trade, and began levying taxes on the hundreds of opium dens that had sprung up in the capital. This policy created a strange situation where the Chinese elite, along with foreign settlers from Britain, France, Russia, and the United States, flocked to these dens because they knew that the tax-free opium being sold was probably smuggled and therefore much stronger than the regulated stuff. The opium dens became an integral part of Beijing life, so much so that the city became known as the opium metropolis of the East. In the bustling alleys and courtyards around the Temple of Heaven, ordinary Chinese smoked alongside merchants and diplomats from abroad in bank rooms shrouded in darkness and the stench of stale waste. There, the rich and powerful mingled with beggars and coolies over bowls of cheap tea and opium pipes. The rich bought finely dressed Chinese women to cater to their every need, while the poor shared battered clay pipes and cheap hashish. Here, amidst the haze of opium smoke, social barriers dissolved and the world outside ceased to exist. It was here in these dark corners of the city that Western influence was at its greatest in China. Foreign devils sat elbow to elbow with the Chinese elite, sharing stories of their homeland and smoking the finest opium money could buy. The scene was a far cry from the rigid social order of traditional China, where foreigners were supposed to be kept out, and Chinese society was sharply divided into classes. Eyewitnesses to this strange melting pot of cultures in the opium dens described scenes that were at once shocking and surreal. In a typical den, they wrote, one might find 5 or 6 men slumped over tables, their bodies ravaged by disease and emaciation, their eyes vacant and staring, barely breathing, lost in dreams of a morphine-induced paradise. Velvet-cushioned chambers, where debauched noblemen reclined with painted girls, while commoners huddled in the corners nursing their pipes. But despite the alluring haze of opium smoke, all was not well in the eyes of the Empress Dowager. While the drug offered a temporary escape from the harsh realities of life in early 20th century China, it did little to alleviate the deep-seated problems that plagued the nation. And besides, Cixi had seen firsthand how opium addiction had ruined lives and families, leaving a trail of broken bodies and hollowed-out shells of their former selves in its wake. As the years passed, she grew increasingly concerned about the toll opium was taking on her people. She saw the growing number of addicts in the streets, heard the anguished cries of mothers whose children had been lost to the drug, and watched helplessly as countless lives were destroyed. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, she couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. She knew that if something didn't change, China would be lost forever. That's why when a new threat appeared in 1900, she didn't resist. Instead, she welcomed it, calling themselves the Society of Righteous and Harmonious. The Boxers were a secret society of rebels who blamed foreign devils and Christian missionaries for China's woes. For years, they'd protested against Western encroachment by attacking foreign businesses and Chinese Christians. But in 1900, they launched a full-scale attack on Beijing itself. Led by a mysterious figure known as the Boxer the Victor, the rebels seized key points around the city, including the 2 railway stations and several government offices. They also surrounded the legations of the 8 foreign powers in China, trapping the diplomats and their families inside. Soon, the entire city was in chaos as the Boxers rampaged through the streets, killing anyone who didn't support them. Cixi was trapped in her palace, unable to leave. The Qing court appealed to the British and French governments for help, and soon an 8-nation army of 50,000 troops was marching on Beijing. The Boxers were crushed, and the siege of the legations ended. But the victory came at a high price. The Qing court had to pay 45 million silver dollars in reparations, further crippling the imperial treasury and entrenching foreign powers in the affairs of China. The Qing government was left with no choice but to bow to the demands of the foreign powers. The Empress Dowager reluctantly agreed to the terms and signed the Treaty of Beijing, officially ending the Boxer Rebellion and marking the beginning of a new era in Chinese history. Cixi stepped down in favor of her grandson, the last emperor Hu Yi, and died 3 years later in 1907, having failed to save China from the menace of the foreigner and the addiction of opium. Thank you for staying with this story. Now, we drift gently into the closing chapter of Imperial China. The Forbidden City is quiet. No parades. Just whispers behind closed doors. 1911. Xinhai Revolution. The monarchy ends. A boy emperor signs away the dynasty. There is no battle. The Qing surrender in ink and on paper. A long scroll of abdication. What follows are decades of ruin. The bannermen ride off into the sunset. The Forbidden City is stripped bare. The people cheer. But the revolution fails to end the suffering. From the ashes of the old order rises chaos. An army marches on Beijing, but soon they're marching on home again. They cannot stop the collapse. After years of foreign wars, economic crisis, natural disaster, and peasant revolt, the great Qing is dead. But before the smoke clears, another story begins. This is the fall of the Qing. Part 2, the warlord era and opium finance. When the Qing fell, it untethered a great beast of chaos that roamed across the land. It was called the warlord era. Hundreds of generals raised their own armies and claimed vast territories for themselves. They fought over river basins and mountain passes, always hungry for more. They carved up provinces and fought over cities. In those days, power flowed like water, and the great rivers of China ran red with war. For 2 decades, from 1916 to 1928, the nation was mired in civil war, and no one could stop it. The warlords held too many weapons, and who would have challenged them? The new KMT government or the embryonic Communist Party. Each had their own plans for the future of China. Neither was ready to fight, so they watched from the sidelines as the country burned. Villagers caught between warring armies suffered the most. They'd worked for generations to tame the land into farmland, and now the soil lay fallow. Crops rotted in the fields. Famine stalked the countryside. Poppy fields bloomed where rice paddies should be. That's because warlords bankrolled their armies with the opium trade. Poppy cultivation skyrocketed after the revolution. It's estimated that the area planted in poppies increased from 100,000 to 700,000 acres. Entire villages were leveled so the soil could be used to grow opium. Fields were often planted around farmhouses. Men, women, and children were forced to tend to the crops and harvest the pods when they turned black and split open. If anyone tried to escape, soldiers would drag them back to the fields and punish them. The Manchurians and Hui were the first groups to turn to opium finance. They established monopolies in provinces like Sichuan, Hubei, and Hunan, and other factions followed suit. Soon, warlords across China were funding their armies with poppy crops. But the villagers couldn't just eat the profits. They paid a heavy price for opium finance. Food became scarce. They raided neighbors' pantries, then their own granaries. Children went hungry. Bellying mothers sold daughters into marriage. Some families escaped, others died. Those who survived had nothing left. By the time the fields were harvested, opium finance hollowed out the countryside. Once the crop was gathered, the farmers had to pay a tax to the warlords. They paid with their labor, working the fields until sundown. They paid with their property, surrendering their livestock and farm equipment to the military. They paid with their dignity, Soldiers looted what was left and raped the women. But even after all that, there wasn't much money left. Most of the profits flowed out of China. The international gangs and companies profited from the chaos. They sent their agents into the countryside to establish monopolies on opium sales. Many of these agents were British, German, Japanese, or Russian. The warlords didn't want to deal with foreigners, but they needed their money. So they set up markets on the borders where smugglers could buy opium duty-free. Agents of the former Qing government, such as the notorious warlord Xian Yuxing, smuggled opium across borders for sale in foreign markets. Opium finance made warlords rich. It also fed the addiction crisis in China. In 1915, the world opium market was worth an estimated 3 billion Chinese dollars. Opium dens flourished in every city. Addicts were everywhere. Opium was a constant fixture in the lives of countless Chinese men. They started young. One author recalled that when he was a boy, he could tell an addict by the red dot on his forehead, the mark left by the hot poker used to cauterize the nostrils after sniffing opium. By the 1920s, this generation of addicts was grown. Now their children were born addicted to the stuff. They were known as little wavers. A mother might carry her child into an opium den and lay him down next to her while she inhaled the smoke. When the baby was old enough to crawl, he would start looking for the white powder under the table. Soon he would sniff it and become an addict himself. Opium dens had become nurseries. Whole families were lost to addiction. Husbands, wives, and children were reduced to shadows of their former selves. All their thoughts were about getting high. Opium addiction was a public health crisis, and the Qing collapse was creating social disorder. The international community wanted to do something about it. France convened an international conference in 1912. China wasn't invited. Representatives from 24 nations met in Shanghai to discuss how to profit from the opium trade. Eventually, they agreed to shut down the domestic opium markets in their own countries. But the only purpose of this was to protect China's opium supply. Once China was stabilized, they planned to re-legalize opium in their countries and get the trade flowing again. It was a cynical game played by Western powers, and none of it helped China. From the 1920s, the Kuomintang began fighting back against the warlords. But opium finance continued to fund military operations. Even Chiang Kai-shek's troops grew opium poppies to sustain themselves. While studying in Japan in the early 1900s, Chiang had gotten hooked on cigarettes. He knew how addictive products could make people lose their minds, and he wanted to capitalize on it. The Kuomintang set up state-run opium farms, factories, and shops. They even wrote pamphlets describing the benefits of smoking. After Chiang came to power in 1928, he launched the anti-opium campaign. But the policy didn't go anywhere. It was undone by the communists. In 1934, Mao Zedong issued a directive. Peasants were allowed to grow opium poppies on half of their farmland. As soon as the directive was issued, poppy fields sprouted overnight. The opium trade funded the communist war effort. During World War II, the Japanese occupied the main poppy-growing regions. Mao ordered the peasants to destroy the plants instead of letting the Japanese harvest them. After the war, opium finance caused misery for the communists too. But we can see why the warlords did it. They were fighting to take control of the country and establish their own power bases. They had no hesitation using brutal methods. But the international actors, profiting from China's misery, were faceless. We don't know who exactly was involved, although several major crime organizations flourished during the era. The triads had evolved since their mid-Qing origins. Now they operated across multiple provinces. Some were based in Shanghai and smuggled opium in from abroad. Others focused on extortion and kidnapping. Members of the Qi-On-Tong triad kidnapped wealthy Chinese businessmen and demanded ransoms. When the victims' families refused to pay, the kidnappers took extreme measures. In the end, the opium trade outlived the Qing Dynasty. Its roots dug deep into China's soil, and its tendrils reached into every province. It changed hands many times as the warlords struggled for control, but its hold on the nation never weakened. The smoke rose in many directions, toward foreign shores and distant markets, toward armies in the field, toward opium dens and gambling halls, and finally toward the mansions of the warlords. None of them could escape the lure of easy money. All of them were sucked into the same vortex of profit and ruin. The Great Qing collapsed in 1911, but opium finance kept the Qing alive. It prolonged the agony, sustaining the warlords and feeding the addiction crisis. But if opium finance made China sick, the foreign monopoly cured it. After 1949, the People's Republic outlawed opium. Mao declared that drug addiction was a symptom of spiritual emptiness, and he wanted to save the masses from themselves. The ban lasted 50 years. Opium poppy cultivation dropped from 700,000 acres to 35 acres. By 1960, the number of addicts had dropped from 20 million to 300,000. In 1982, opium was legalized again. The government created a state monopoly to produce and sell opium for medical purposes. Farmers were encouraged to grow poppies. Today, China is the world's largest producer of opium. This is our final step, friend. You've followed a thread through blood and silk, through smoke and silence. Now we awaken in a new China one that tries to forget. The fields once bloomed with poppies, a sea of crimson stretching to the horizon. Now only ashes remain. Mao's iron fist closed around China's opium addiction, crushing millions beneath its weight. The flames that consumed those fields burned away more than just flowers. They scorched the very fabric of a culture. In the silence that followed, a nation held its breath. The addicts, once ubiquitous, vanished like morning mist. Fear became the new drug, coursing through veins where opium once flowed. Rehabilitation centers sprouted like weeds, their walls echoing with the screams of forced withdrawal. The party's message was clear: conform or be consumed. But even as the last embers of the poppy fields cooled, something else began to smolder. Stories, passed in whispers from grandmother to child, kept the memories alive. Tales of a different China, one where ancient remedies and traditions weren't crimes. These stories became lifelines, tethering a people to their past, even as the present sought to sever all ties. The school books were rewritten, museums curated to show only approved history. Yet in the corners of homes, in the creases of weathered hands, the old ways persisted. Acupuncture needles, once openly displayed, now hidden beneath floorboards. Herbal remedies mixed in secret, and recipes guarded like precious jewels. As the years passed, the silence grew heavier. A generation raised on propaganda struggled to reconcile the sanitized version of history with the fragments that slipped through the cracks. They looked at their elders and saw ghosts of a world they could never truly know. The Opium Wars, once a distant memory, became China's rallying cry. A wound that never truly healed, festering beneath the surface of national pride. In diplomatic halls and international forums, it was wielded like a weapon, a reminder of past humiliations and a warning against future transgressions. The world moved on, but China's relationship with its opium past remained complex. Addiction, once seen as a moral failing, began to be understood as a public health issue. Yet the shadows of Mao's crackdown lingered, coloring every discussion, every policy decision. In the bustling cities of modern China, where neon lights chase away the darkness, the ghosts of the opium era still whisper. They speak of a time when pain and pleasure were intertwined, when escape was found in smoky dens rather than smartphone screens. The young may not hear these whispers, but they feel their echo in the very air they breathe. The erasure was never complete. Like water seeping through cracks in concrete, the past finds ways to resurface. In art galleries, brave souls dare to explore themes of addiction and loss. In literature, veiled references slip past censors, hinting at the complexities of a history too nuanced for official narratives. As night falls over the land that once grew poppies, a different kind of silence descends. It's a silence pregnant with unspoken words, with stories yearning to be told. In this quiet, the weight of history presses down, a constant reminder of all that was lost and all that remains hidden. The legacy of opium in China is not just about addiction or international conflict. It's about identity, about the struggle to reconcile a complex past with an uncertain future. It's about the power of memory to shape a nation's soul, even when that memory is fragmented and suppressed. In parks and public squares, elderly men and women gather to practice Tai Chi, their slow movements a dance with invisible forces. Some of them remember a time before Mao's crackdown, before the world turned upside down. Their bodies hold memories their tongues dare not speak, a living archive of vanished world. The younger generations, born into a China of skyscrapers and high-speed rails, carry a different burden. They inherit a history both glorified and sanitized, expected to feel the sting of century-old humiliations while celebrating present-day triumphs. In their hearts, a quiet rebellion stirs, not against the state, but against the simplification of their heritage. As the global conversation around drug policy evolves, China watches warily. The specter of the Opium Wars looms large, coloring every international negotiation, every trade deal. In the halls of power, strategists weigh the benefits of engagement against the risks of perceived weakness. The past is not just prologue. It's a lens through which every action is viewed. Yet even as official narratives calcify, cracks appear. In online forums and private WeChat groups, curious minds seek out forbidden knowledge. They piece together fragments of history, comparing notes and challenging assumptions. This digital underground keeps alive the spirit of inquiry, the hunger for truth that no crackdown can fully extinguish. The aftermath of erasure is not emptiness, but a charged absence. Like a scar on the landscape, it marks where something once was, inviting questions, demanding explanations. Each generation must grapple anew with this legacy, finding their own way to carry the weight of unspoken histories. As dawn breaks over a land transformed, the ghosts of the opium era fade back into the mists of memory, but they do not disappear entirely. They linger in the collective unconscious, in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from. In this space between remembering and forgetting, a nation continues to define itself, one whispered tale at a time. Soft breeze rustles, distant thunder rumbles. In the quiet that follows, we're left to ponder our own relationship with the past. How do we honor our history without being bound by it? What stories do we choose to tell, and which do we let slip away into silence? Radio crackle fades in and out. If these questions resonate with you, if you've felt the weight of unspoken histories in your own life, know that you're not alone. Our stories, however fragmented, connect us across time and space. Share your thoughts, your own whispered tales, in the comments below. And if you'd like to explore more hidden histories, consider subscribing to our channel. Together, we can ensure that even in silence, our stories endure. Soft breeze fades to silence.